The screens in Sector 4 did not just fail. They detonated into a soundless, blistering white. Vale recoiled, his nictitating membranes slamming shut as the photonic monitors vomited a lethal dose of lumens into his high-gain optic nerves. In the center of the blinding void, the human female did not flinch. Saskia merely tilted her wrist, checking a watch that shouldn't have been visible. What you are about to hear is a matter of restricted record. I suggest you listen carefully, because the shadows we live in aren't as empty as we believe. It is a standard security processing. The intake drone had hummed. That was 3 hours ago, before they stripped her of the heavy orange vest and locked her in the airless dark of a Category 4 isolation cell. Sector 4 was designed for the erasure of the self. To a human, the room was a literal nothingness. No photons, no tactile orientation, just the oppressive velvet weight of a vacuum-sealed chamber. But for an Oromis, the room was a masterpiece of clarity. Vale sat behind the reinforced transparency of the observation glass, his primary and secondary pupils dilated to the size of coins. He didn't need a light source. His eyes were scavengers, capable of harvesting the stray infrared radiation emitted by a human's own body heat. To him, Saskia was a glowing, amber silhouette against a backdrop of deep indigo. Click. The rhythm was off. A loose cooling fan in the ceiling of the observation booth stuttered every 4 seconds. A tiny, mechanical hiccup in an otherwise silent facility. Vale found it annoying. He adjusted his focus, watching the way Saskia's carotid artery pulsed in her neck. It was steady. Too steady for someone who had been plunged into a sensory void for nearly 200 minutes. Most species broke by now. Deprived of visual stimuli, the brain usually began to manufacture its own horrors. The Oromis used this. They waited for the moment the subject began to claw at the walls, desperate for a single ray of light. Then, and only then, would the interrogation begin. But Saskia just sat. Beneath the observation glass, she looked like a statue carved from heat. Vale noted the faint, powdery scent of medical-grade latex clinging to her fingertips as she rubbed her hands together. It was a mundane detail, yet it bothered him. She was a paramedic, a low-level biological repair unit from a backwater colony. She shouldn't have been this calm, because the Oromis optics were too perfect, too sensitive. Vale's species had evolved in the bioluminescent canyons of their home world. They could see the faint electric shimmer of a nervous system. They could track a predator by the heat of its breath. In the absolute dark of Sector 4, they were gods. Humans, by contrast, were practically blind. Their visual purple took ages to adapt. They were supposed to be helpless here. "You are wasting your time," Vale broadcasted into the cell. His voice was a flat, synthesized tone that stripped away any hint of his own biological tension. Saskia didn't look up. "About 9 seconds, she whispered. 9 seconds until what? Until I decide if you're actually listening or just watching." Vale's chromatophores shifted to a jagged pattern of curiosity. He looked at her medical kit, which had been dumped on a sterile tray just outside the glass. It was filled with primitive tools, fabric bandages, metal shears, small plastic tubes. It was junk. The Oromis used regenerative gels and molecular welders. To them, a human paramedic was like a child trying to fix a starship with mud and sticks. Quiet. The silence in the cell was absolute, save for the hum of the life support scrubbers. Vale watched as Saskia reached into the pocket of her trousers. She had been searched, of course. But the Oromis scanners looked for weapons, high-energy cells, sharpened alloys, chemical toxins. They didn't care about a 6-inch tube of flexible plastic. She pulled it out. It was an emergency glowstick. To Vale, it looked like a useless toy, a hollow cylinder filled with a dormant, translucent liquid. There was no battery, no wiring, no heat signature. He watched with clinical detachment as she held it between her thumb and forefinger. "I used to work triage during the citywide blackouts," Saskia said, her voice echoing strangely in the dead air. "You learn a lot about the dark when the power goes out. You learn that it's never actually empty." Vale leaned forward. His pupils were wide, drinking in the faint infrared glow of her skin. He didn't realize he was overdilated. He didn't realize his photonic amplifiers were pushed to their absolute maximum gain to track the microexpressions on her face. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she looked almost bored. She began to flex the plastic tube. It made a sharp, cracking sound that sliced through the silence like a blade. Vale flinched, his sensitive ears twitching. "Stop that," Vale commanded. "I can't," Saskia replied. Her thumb pressed into the center of the tube. "The glass inside is already broken. The chemicals are already mixing." Vale felt a strange prickle of unease. He looked at the tube again. It was beginning to shimmer. Not with heat, Oromis sensors would have flagged a thermal spike, but with something else. And then nothing. For a fraction of a second, the world remained indigo and amber. Then the first lumen hit. It was a cold light, a chemical birth that didn't follow the rules of Oromis physics. Vale's monitors, synced to his own optic nerves, began to jitter. The high-gain photonic amplifiers, designed to find light in a vacuum, suddenly found themselves staring directly into the sun. He didn't have time to scream. The chemicals inside the tube did not explode. There was no combustion, no thermal spike, and no warning from the station's sophisticated heat detection arrays. Instead, a silent marriage occurred between hydrogen peroxide and a phenyl oxalate ester. It was a cold light, which made the physics impossible. Vale's species did not understand light without heat. In the bioluminescent trenches of Oromis, every spark was a byproduct of energy, a warm signal of life or friction. But this green, ethereal glow was a purely chemical defiance of the dark. The Oromis security suite, designed to track the thermal flicker of a heartbeat through a meter of lead, found itself gasping at a chemical reaction that produced no heat, no smoke, and no sound, yet possessed enough raw photonic energy to melt the very concept of darkness. Vale's nictitating membranes, already wide to capture the amber warmth of Saskia's skin, could not close fast enough. The sensors in the booth, slaved to his own optic nerves, attempted to compensate for the sudden influx of photons by cranking the gain even higher. It was a feedback loop of catastrophic proportions. The dry, rhythmic scratch of Vale's data stylus against the pad stopped. He was blind. White. Pure, screaming white. The monitors in the observation booth did not just fail. They became suns. Vale felt the secondary nictitating membranes over his eyes seize, locking tight in a futile attempt to protect his brain from the overload. His chromatophores bleached to a translucent, deathly gray, the biological equivalent of a system crash. 9 seconds, Saskia's voice drifted through the intercom, sounding impossibly distant through the roar of static in Vale's ears. "Excuse me," Vale managed to choke out. His hands fumbled for the manual override, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly missed the toggle. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't ask for permission. He simply lurched toward the exit, his sensitive skin prickling with the sheer intensity of the cold energy radiating from the cell. Behind him, Saskia stood in the center of Sector 4. She wasn't blinded. Her human eyes, conditioned by years of night shift triage in the flickering blackouts of the outer rim, had spent the last 3 hours adapting to the dark. Her visual purple had flooded her retinas, a biological superpower the Oromis had completely overlooked in their quest for technological perfection. To her, the Glowstick wasn't a sun. It was a soft, comforting neon green. She watched the shadow of the Interrogator vanish from the observation window. The Oromis had built a prison of perfect darkness, forgetting that humans have been carrying their own light into the void for millennia. 6 weeks later, the silence in the High Command's office was heavy. Vale sat at a desk that felt too large for his diminished stature. His eyes were still clouded, the secondary membranes scarred by a permanent milky film that no medical welder could repair. He didn't look at the data slate. He didn't need to. He knew the numbers by heart now. The Oromis Security Directive 904 was being rewritten in its entirety. It was no longer a matter of identifying weapons. It was a matter of identifying intent. On his desk sat a single, spent plastic tube. It was colorless now, the chemical reaction long since exhausted, but it carried a weight that no plasma rifle could match. Vale reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth, cheap plastic. Beside it lay his formal resignation. The paper was crisp, white, and final. The report on Saskia had been filed under a new classification, high-risk espionage asset. Not because she carried a bomb, but because she carried a kit designed to sustain life in conditions that should have been lethal. The Oromis had spent centuries perfecting the art of the dark, only to be defeated by a species that found the dark merely inconvenient. It was a cascading failure of the primary retinal arrays, a total saturation of the neural link that bridged Vale's organic consciousness to the station's high-gain sensors, effectively turning his own biological brilliance into a weapon that scorched his mind from the inside out. Vale stood up. He left the resignation on the desk. He left the glowstick where it was. He walked toward the transport hubs, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a man who no longer trusted the light. Somewhere in the outer rim, Saskia was likely cracking another tube, unaware that she had rewritten the security protocols of an empire. The green plastic cylinder caught the afternoon sun, casting a long, distorted shadow across the official seal of the Oromis High Command.